Pretend to be my boyfriend, please. Nina Carter didn't wait to see how he would react before realizing she had already gone too far to take it back. Her hand tightened around his sleeve for a brief second, then loosened as recognition hit her like cold water. She knew who he was. Not personally, not in any way that mattered. But enough. Enough to understand. She hadn't just picked a stranger. Oh God, she muttered under her breath, forcing herself to stay still instead of pulling away. I really picked the worst possible person. If he heard her, he didn't show it. His eyes moved over her face, then briefly to her hand, then back again, calm and unreadable, like he was deciding whether she was worth the trouble. 2 minutes, she added quickly, lowering her voice. That's all I need. I swear. He took his time answering, like silence itself was part of the process. Who are we hiding from? My ex, she said, glancing behind her. And he doesn't take rejection well. He followed her gaze for a moment, then stepped closer without hesitation. His hand settled at her back, firm enough to make the gesture believable, controlled enough not to startle her. All right, he said quietly. Let's not make this look amateur. Nina barely had time to breathe before Derek's voice cut in. Nina, what exactly is going on here? She didn't move. I'm with someone. Derek let out a sharp laugh, the kind that didn't come from amusement. With him? Since when do you do anything this impulsive? Since I stopped asking for your permission, she replied, her voice steady despite the tension building in her chest. Derek stepped closer, his expression tightening. You don't even know him, he said. You think grabbing the first guy you see is going to fix whatever this is? I don't need to fix anything, Nina said. That was enough to push him over. His hand shot out, grabbing her arm hard this time, no attempt to hide it. No, you don't get to ignore me, he snapped. You don't get to act like I don't exist. Nina winced slightly. Derek, let go. Not until you stop this, he said, his voice rising just enough to draw attention. She tried to pull free, but before she could, the man beside her moved. His hand closed around Derek's wrist, controlled and precise, forcing the grip to loosen without effort. Nina was pulled back a step at the same time, the movement smooth, deliberate. Derek barely had a second to react before the punch landed. It wasn't wild or angry. It was clean, direct, final. The sound cut through the music, sharp enough to turn heads even in a room trained to ignore conflict. Derek stumbled back, hitting the edge of a table, one hand already coming up to his jaw. The man stepped forward once, placing himself fully between Nina and Derek. His posture stayed relaxed, but there was no mistaking the shift in control. Who exactly, he said, his voice calm in a way that made it worse, gave you permission to put your hands on my girlfriend? The word hung there, deliberate, impossible to misinterpret. Nina felt her breath catch, not because of what he said, but because of how easily he said it. Derek blinked, thrown off balance in more ways than one. You're what? He muttered, shaking his head slightly. Look, I don't know who you think you are, but... He stopped, really looked at him this time. Recognition settled in slowly, and with it, hesitation. Wait, Derek said, quieter now. You're D'Angelo? The man didn't answer, he just held his gaze. Derek's posture shifted, the anger still there but no longer reckless. He glanced at Nina, then back again, recalculating. This isn't over, he said finally, though the certainty was gone. We'll talk again. Not like this, the man replied evenly. Not again. Derek hesitated, then looked away first. Without another word, he turned and disappeared into the crowd. The tension lingered for a moment before the room quietly reset itself, conversations resuming, music filling the space again as if nothing had happened. Nina let out a slow breath, her arm still tingling where Derek had grabbed her. She looked up at the man beside her, still trying to catch up with everything that had just happened. You didn't have to do that, she said. He shouldn't have touched you, he replied simply. She studied him for a second, then shook her head slightly. I meant the part where you knocked him down. A faint shift crossed his expression, barely noticeable. That part too. Nina let out a quiet breath, something between disbelief and realization. That wasn't normal. No, he said. It wasn't. She glanced toward where Derek had disappeared, then back at him. I really didn't think this through. Most people don't. he said. She huffed a soft breath. I grabbed a stranger and asked him to pretend to be my boyfriend, she said, then met his eyes again. Except you're not exactly a stranger, are you? His gaze stayed on hers, steady, unreadable. No, he said. I'm not. Nina paused, then gave a small shake of her head. Yeah, I definitely picked the wrong person. He watched her for a moment, then said quietly, or maybe you didn't. The words settled heavier than she expected. Roman didn't move his hand right away, and Nina became aware of it again, the steady pressure at the small of her back, grounding and possessive in a way that felt less like an act now and more like a decision he hadn't undone yet. The room had already swallowed the disruption, conversations rising back into place, laughter returning in polite waves. But something had shifted for her in a way that didn't reset so easily. You can let go now, she said quietly, not pulling away, just stating it. Roman glanced down at her, then at his own hand, as if considering whether the moment had actually ended. After a second, he stepped back, removing it without apology. You're still shaking, he said. I'm not, Nina replied automatically, then flexed her fingers and realized he was right. She exhaled slowly. Okay. Maybe a little. That's normal, he said, like he was stating a fact rather than offering comfort. She let out a short breath that almost sounded like a laugh. Good to know I'm having a normal reaction to completely insane choices. Roman didn't smile, but something about the way his gaze softened just slightly made it feel like he understood the weight behind the words. You handled him, he said. Most people don't. I didn't handle anything, Nina said, shaking her head. I panicked and grabbed the most dangerous man in the room. That's one way to look at it, he replied. She looked at him more carefully now, really taking him in without the haze of adrenaline. Up close, the details were sharper, the faint lines at the corners of his eyes, the controlled stillness in the way he stood, the kind of presence that didn't ask for attention but took it anyway. You're not denying that part, she said. No, Roman said. I'm not. The honesty of it caught her off guard. Most people would have deflected, softened it, turned it into something easier to accept. He didn't bother. Nina folded her arms loosely, more to give herself something to do than out of defensiveness. So what now? She asked. Do we just go our separate ways and pretend that didn't happen? Roman followed her gaze briefly as it moved across the room, then back to her. If you walk away now, he said, he'll think he got to you. He did get to me, Nina replied. That's the whole reason I'm standing here. That's not what he'll see, Roman said. He'll see you alone. Nina hesitated, then let out a quiet breath. You're saying I should keep pretending. I'm saying you already started, he replied. Might as well finish it properly. She considered that for a moment, then nodded once. Okay. So, what does properly look like? Roman's gaze flicked toward a table near the edge of the ballroom, slightly removed from the main crowd. We don't stand in the middle of the room like we're waiting for instructions, he said. We move. There was no force in the suggestion, but it didn't feel optional either. Nina followed his lead, falling into step beside him as they crossed the floor. The shift was subtle, but she felt it immediately, heads turning, glances lingering just a second longer than before. It wasn't about her, it was about him. You're used to this, she said under her breath as they walked. Yes. That obvious? Only if you know what you're looking for. They reached the table, and Roman pulled out a chair with a small, efficient movement that felt more like habit than courtesy. Nina sat, smoothing her hands over her lap as she tried to steady herself. Roman took the seat across from her, his posture relaxed but attentive, like nothing around him required effort. A server approached almost immediately, setting down 2 glasses of water without asking. Nina noticed the way he addressed Roman, quiet, respectful, a slight shift in tone that didn't quite reach deference but came close. Mr. D'Angelo, the man said, can I get you anything else? Roman shook his head. Not right now. The server nodded and moved away. Nina watched him go, then looked back at Roman. You didn't even order that, she said, gesturing to the glasses. No. So he just knew? Yes. She let out a slow breath. Right. Of course he did. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The distance between them was small, but it felt deliberate, like a space he had chosen to leave intact. Nina picked up the glass, more to occupy her hands than anything else, and took a small sip. You do this a lot? She asked after a moment. Do what? Step in when things get messy, she said. Punch people who cross a line. Roman's expression didn't change. I deal with problems, he said. That was one. Nina tilted her head slightly. That sounded like a professional answer. It is, she almost smiled. Do you always talk like that? Only when there's something worth saying. Nina leaned back slightly, studying him again. And right now? Roman's gaze met hers. Right now I'm trying to figure out why you're still here. The question landed more directly than she expected. She opened her mouth to answer, then paused, realizing she didn't have one ready. I could ask you the same thing, she said instead. You could, he agreed, but you won't answer. No. That earned a quiet laugh from her, softer this time, less strained. You're not making this easy. I'm not trying to, he said. There was no edge in it, just fact. Nina looked down at her hands for a moment, then back up. You know, most people would have walked away, she said, pretended they didn't hear me, didn't see anything, didn't want to get involved. Roman didn't respond immediately. When he did, his voice was lower, more measured. Most people aren't in a position to decide whether they get involved, he said. And you are. Yes. She held his gaze for a second longer than necessary, then nodded slowly. That must be convenient. It's efficient, he corrected. Sounds lonely. The word slipped out before she could stop it. Roman's expression didn't change, but something in his posture shifted, subtle, and almost imperceptible. It works, he said. Nina didn't push it. She recognized the boundary for what it was and let it stand. Across the room, movement caught her attention. Derek had reappeared near the bar, talking to someone. But his eyes flicked in their direction again. The look was different now, not confident, not dismissive. Watching. He's still here, she said quietly. I know. You're not worried about that? Roman followed her gaze briefly, then looked back at her. No. The certainty in his voice settled something in her chest, even if she didn't fully understand why. Nina exhaled slowly. I should probably go soon, she said, before this turns into something bigger than it already is. Roman leaned back slightly, his eyes still on her. It already is, he said. She frowned. What does that mean? It means he's not going to leave it alone, Roman replied. Men like that don't. Nina's jaw tightened slightly. I can handle Derek. Roman studied her for a moment, then nodded once. I don't doubt that you think you can. That's not what I said. No, he agreed. It's not. The quiet challenge in his tone made her sit up straighter. I've dealt with him before, she said. I'll deal with him again. Roman didn't argue. He simply said, then you should be careful. Nina held his gaze, then gave a small nod. I am. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The noise of the ballroom filled the space again, but it felt distant now, like it belonged to a different version of the night. Thank you, she said finally. For all of it. Roman inclined his head slightly. You're welcome. She stood then, smoothing her dress again, more out of habit than necessity. I think that's my cue to exit before I make any more questionable decisions. Roman rose as well, his movements unhurried. If you leave now, he said, leave through the side corridor. It's quieter. Nina blinked. You're giving me an escape route? I'm giving you options, he said. She hesitated, then smiled faintly. Same thing. Roman didn't return the smile. But he didn't look away either. Not always. Nina took a step back, then another, creating distance she wasn't entirely sure she wanted. Good night, Roman. Good night, Nina. She paused at the sound of her name. I don't remember telling you that. You didn't, he said. For a second, she just looked at him, trying to decide how to feel about that. Then she turned and walked away, her steps steady even as her thoughts weren't. She didn't look back until she reached the edge of the room. And when she did, he was still there, exactly where she had left him, watching in a way that didn't feel casual. Nina turned forward again and kept walking, because something told her that if she stayed, even for one more minute, she might not leave at all. Tell me honestly in the comments where you're watching from. I read every single one. And if you want to find out what happens next, make sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the rest of the story. Nina didn't go back to the ballroom after that. She followed the side corridor Roman had mentioned, the noise of the wedding fading with each step until it became nothing more than a distant hum behind closed doors. The hallway was quieter, dimmer, lined with framed photographs of past events that all looked the same: perfect smiles, polished lives, people who belonged. She walked past them without slowing, her reflection catching briefly in the glass, a reminder that she had never quite fit into rooms like this, no matter how close she stood to them. Outside, the night air hit her face, cool and grounding. She exhaled slowly, letting the tension drain out of her shoulders, but it didn't leave completely. Something about the evening clung to her, not just the confrontation with Derek, not just the reckless decision to grab a stranger, but the man she had chosen without thinking. Roman D'Angelo. Even saying the name in her head felt like stepping into something she didn't understand yet. She started walking without a clear direction, heels clicking softly against the pavement. The city alive in that quiet New York way, distant traffic, a cab idling at the corner, a couple arguing across the street in voices too low to catch the words but loud enough to feel the emotion. Normal life. Uninterrupted. Untouched by whatever had just happened inside that hotel. Her phone buzzed in her hand. She glanced down, already knowing who it would be. Derek. The screen lit up with his name, followed by a message before she even had time to decide whether to answer. "We need to talk." Nina stared at it for a moment, her thumb hovering, then she locked the screen and slipped the phone into her bag. Not tonight. She kept walking, her pace steady, her breathing finally evening out. But her thoughts refused to settle. Roman's voice echoed in the back of her mind, calm and certain. Men like that don't leave things alone. She didn't like how easily she believed him. She reached the subway entrance but didn't go down right away. Instead, she leaned briefly against the railing, closing her eyes for a second, letting the noise of the city move around her. For the first time in a long time, she felt something unfamiliar, pressing in under the exhaustion. Not fear exactly. Not relief either. Something sharper. Awareness. Maybe. Like a door had opened and she hadn't decided yet whether to step through it or run in the opposite direction. Her phone buzzed again. This time she pulled it out. Another message from Derek. "You embarrassed me tonight." Nina let out a quiet breath through her nose. Of course that's what he focused on. Not what he'd done. Not the way he'd grabbed her. Not the line he had crossed so easily. Just his pride. She started typing, stopped, deleted it, then tried again. "Leave me alone." She hit send before she could second guess it. The response came almost immediately. "You think that guy is going to protect you?" Nina's jaw tightened. She stared at the message longer than she should have, then typed back, "I don't need anyone to protect me." She slipped the phone back into her bag before he could respond again, pushing herself away from the railing and heading down into the subway. The station smelled faintly of metal and something older, something that had soaked into the walls over time. A train was already pulling in, the screech of brakes cutting through the quiet. Nina stepped on without thinking, finding a seat near the door, her reflection faint in the darkened window. As the train moved, she let her head rest back against the glass, watching the tunnel lights blur past. Her mind drifted despite her effort to keep it grounded, circling back to the same moment again and again. The way Roman had looked at Derek, the way he hadn't raised his voice, the way he had stepped in without hesitation, like it wasn't a question of whether he should, but simply whether it was necessary. And then there was the way he had looked at her. Not like Derek did, measuring her, reducing her, deciding her worth based on what she could offer. Roman had looked at her like she was something else entirely. Not fragile. Not insignificant. Just there. She didn't know what to do with that. The train rocked gently, steady and predictable, a rhythm she was used to. She rode it all the way to her stop, climbed the stairs, and stepped back out into the night. Her apartment was only a few blocks away, a small studio on the Upper West Side that cost more than it should and offered less than she deserved, but it was hers. That mattered. Inside, the space was quiet, the kind of quiet that settled quickly once the door was closed. Nina kicked off her shoes, set her bag on the small kitchen counter, and leaned back against it for a moment, letting the stillness wrap around her. This was her world. Simple, controlled, safe. Her phone buzzed again. She didn't want to look. Nina frowned slightly, hesitating before opening it. "You made it home?" She stared at the message, her pulse picking up again, but differently this time. Slower, more focused. There was no name attached, but she didn't need one. "How did you get my number?" She typed it out, then paused, staring at the screen. For a moment, she considered deleting it, pretending she hadn't seen it, closing the door on whatever this was before it had a chance to become something else. Instead, she sent it. The reply came quickly. "You're not as hard to find as you think." Nina let out a quiet breath, somewhere between disbelief and something that might have been a laugh if she let it. That should have unsettled her more than it did. That's not reassuring. A pause this time, longer than before. It wasn't meant to be. She shook her head slightly, pushing off the counter and moving toward the small window near her bed. The city stretched out in front of her, lights scattered across the darkness, each one belonging to someone with their own story, their own mess, their own version of control or chaos. "Why are you texting me?" She sent it before she could overthink it. The answer settled into the room like something heavier than it should have been. Nina leaned one shoulder against the wall, staring out at the city, her reflection faint in the glass. For a moment, she didn't respond. She let the silence stretch, testing it, feeling it. Then she typed, "Maybe I should have." The reply came slower this time. She exhaled, her breath fogging the glass briefly before fading. "But I didn't." This time, the response didn't come right away. Nina waited, her phone warm in her hand, her thoughts quieter now, more focused. When the message finally appeared, it was simple. "I know." She read it once, then again, then locked the screen and set the phone down on the windowsill. Outside, a siren passed somewhere in the distance, fading as quickly as it came. The city kept moving, indifferent, steady. Nina stayed where she was for a long moment, staring out at the lights, feeling the weight of something shifting beneath the surface of everything she thought she understood. She had walked away from the ballroom, but she hadn't walked away from him, and somewhere deep down, she knew that wasn't an accident. Nina didn't sleep well that night, not because she was afraid, but because her mind refused to settle into anything resembling quiet. Every time she closed her eyes, she found herself back in that ballroom, replaying the moment she reached for him, the weight of his hand at her back, the calm certainty in the way he handled something that should have been messy and unpredictable. It wasn't the violence that stayed with her, not really. It was the control, the fact that nothing about him felt accidental. By morning, the city had already moved on, and so had the world. People went to work, coffee shops filled, taxis honked, and nothing in the rhythm of New York suggested that anything unusual had happened. Nina stood behind the counter at the cafe, tying her apron with practiced hands, the familiar scent of coffee and warm pastries grounding her in something real. "You look like you didn't sleep," Maya said from the other end of the counter, glancing over while steaming milk. Her tone wasn't accusatory, just observant in the way that came from knowing someone long enough to notice small changes. "I didn't," Nina admitted, reaching for a stack of cups. "Long night." "Wedding?" Maya asked. "Something like that," Nina replied. Maya raised an eyebrow but didn't push immediately. She handed over a drink to a waiting customer, then leaned in slightly once the line thinned. "You're not usually this distracted," she said. "What happened?" Nina hesitated, then shrugged. "Ran into Derek." That was enough to shift the tone. Maya's expression tightened. He tried," Nina cut in, keeping her voice low. "But it didn't go the way he expected." Maya studied her face for a second. "You okay?" Nina nodded, though the answer wasn't as simple as that. "Yeah, I'm fine." That didn't sound convincing, Maya said. Nina let out a small breath. "I handled it," she said. "Or, someone helped me handle it." Maya tilted her head. "Someone?" Nina reached for the coffee pot, buying herself a second. "Just a guy," she said, though even as the words left her mouth, she knew how inadequate they sounded. Maya didn't miss it. "You don't say just a guy like that unless he's not just a guy," she said. Nina almost smiled. "He's not. So who is he?" Nina hesitated again, then said quietly, "Roman D'Angelo." For a second, Maya didn't react, like the name hadn't fully landed yet. Then her eyes widened just slightly. "You're kidding." "I wish I was." Maya set the pitcher down slowly. "That Roman D'Angelo?" Nina gave a small nod. There was a beat of silence before Maya leaned closer, lowering her voice instinctively. "How exactly do you go from working a wedding to ending up with someone like him?" "I grabbed him," Nina said plainly. Maya blinked. "You what?" "I panicked," Nina said. "Derek was pushing, and I needed an out. so I grabbed the nearest person who looked like he could shut it down. And you picked him? I didn't pick him, Nina corrected. I didn't know who he was until after. Maya stared at her, somewhere between disbelief and concern. And you're just standing here like that's a normal story. It's not a normal story, Nina said. It's just the one I've got. Maya shook her head slowly. That man is not someone you accidentally get involved with. I'm not involved with him, Nina said quickly. Maya didn't look convinced. Are you sure about that? Nina opened her mouth to answer, then paused. The memory of the message from last night flickered in her mind. You didn't run. She pushed it aside. Yes, she said firmly. I'm sure. Maya studied her for another second, then nodded once, though the concern didn't fully leave her expression. Just be careful, she said. Guys like Derek are one thing. Guys like that? She trailed off. I know, Nina said quietly. The conversation was cut short as more customers approached, the rhythm of the morning picking up again. Orders came in, drinks went out, and Nina slipped back into the routine she knew how to manage. For a while it worked. The steady pace gave her something to focus on, something that didn't involve thinking too much. Until the door opened. The shift in the room was subtle, almost imperceptible, but Nina felt it anyway. Not because everyone stopped what they were doing, but because they didn't. Conversations continued, cups clinked, but something in the air tightened just slightly. She didn't look up right away. She didn't need to. You're staring, Maya murmured under her breath. I know, Nina said quietly, though she still hadn't turned. Please tell me that's not him. Nina exhaled slowly, then lifted her eyes. It was. Roman stood just inside the cafe, dressed more casually than the night before, but no less precise. Dark coat, clean lines, nothing out of place. He didn't look around like someone unfamiliar with the space. He simply took it in once, quickly, then his gaze landed on her, and stayed there. Nina felt her pulse pick up again, not with panic this time, but something sharper, more focused. Maya leaned in slightly. That's him, she whispered. Yeah, Nina said. You said you weren't involved. I'm not, Nina replied, though the certainty didn't sound as strong as it had a minute ago. Roman approached the counter without hesitation, ignoring the subtle glances from other customers who sensed something they couldn't quite name. When he stopped in front of her, the space felt smaller somehow, more contained. Morning, he said. Nina blinked once, then nodded. Morning. Maya stepped back just slightly, clearly deciding this was not her conversation. Roman glanced briefly at the menu, then back at Nina. Coffee, he said. Black. Of course, Nina replied, reaching for a cup. Her hands were steady now, the motion familiar enough to anchor her. That's easy. Most things are, he said. She poured the coffee, set it on the counter, then met his gaze again. You didn't answer my question last night, she said. Which one? Why you texted me. Roman picked up the cup but didn't drink. I did answer, he said. You didn't run. That's not really an explanation. It is from my perspective, he replied. Nina leaned one hand against the counter. So what? You're checking to see if I've changed my mind? Roman studied her for a moment. Have you? Nina held his gaze, then shook her head slightly. No. Good, he said, like that settled something. She frowned just slightly. You sound like you expected that. I did. Why? Roman took a small sip of his coffee, then set the cup back down. Because you don't seem like someone who makes the same decision twice in a row, he said. Nina let out a quiet breath. You've known me for less than a day. That's enough, he replied. She shook her head, a faint hint of a smile slipping through despite herself. You're very sure of things. I don't like guessing. Nina glanced around the cafe, suddenly aware again of where they were, of how out of place this conversation was in a room built for simple routines. You came all the way here for coffee? She asked. Roman followed her gaze briefly, then looked back at her. I came to see if you meant what you said, he said. What did I say? That you didn't need anyone to protect you. Nina straightened slightly. I meant it. Roman nodded once. Good. She studied him for a second. You don't believe me. I believe you think that, he said. That's not the same thing. No, he agreed. It's not. There was no judgment in his tone, just observation. Somehow, that made it harder to argue. Nina crossed her arms lightly. So what happens now? Roman considered the question for a moment. That depends, he said. On what? On whether last night was a one-time decision, he replied, or the start of something you're going to have to deal with. Nina felt the weight of that settle in, heavier than she expected. She met his eyes again, steady this time. I guess we're about to find out, she said. Roman held her gaze for a second longer, then gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, like that was the answer he had been waiting for. Roman didn't stay long after that. He finished the coffee in a few slow sips, like he wasn't in any rush but also had no intention of lingering just to fill space. Nina noticed it immediately, the way he moved, the way he chose when a moment was over. Nothing about him dragged on longer than it needed to. You always do that? She asked as he set the empty cup down. Do what? Show up, ask a question, then leave before anyone figures out what it means, she said. Roman looked at her for a second. Not defensive, not amused, just considering. It saves time, he replied. That's one way to look at it. It's the only way that matters to me, he said, then added, I have things to do. Nina nodded slowly. I figured. He didn't say goodbye right away. His eyes lingered on her for a moment longer, like he was confirming something for himself. Then he stepped back. Be careful, he said. You've said that already. I meant it both times. She held his gaze, then gave a small nod. I know. That seemed to be enough. Roman turned and walked out of the cafe without another word, the door closing quietly behind him. The bell above it, giving a soft, ordinary chime that didn't match the weight he left behind. For a few seconds, Nina just stood there, her hands resting on the counter, her thoughts catching up in pieces rather than all at once. Maya was the first to break the silence. So, she said carefully, stepping closer again. That was not normal. Nina let out a slow breath. No, she agreed. It wasn't. Maya crossed her arms. You want to explain why a man like that just walked in here, looked at you like you're the only thing in the room, and then left like he got exactly what he came for? I don't know what he came for, Nina said, though the answer felt closer than she wanted to admit. That didn't look like a random visit. It wasn't random, Nina said. He wanted to see if I meant what I said. And did you? Nina hesitated just long enough for Maya to notice. Yeah, she said finally. Maya studied her face. You're in deeper than you think. I'm not in anything, Nina replied, more quickly than she intended. It was one night. That's it. Maya didn't argue, but she didn't look convinced either. Just don't lie to yourself, she said. That's usually how things go wrong. Nina didn't respond to that. Instead, she picked up a towel and wiped down the counter, more to give herself something to do than because it needed it. The motion helped, grounding her in something simple, something she understood. The rest of the shift passed without anything unusual happening, at least on the surface. Customers came and went, orders were filled, and the rhythm of the cafe stayed intact. But Nina felt it underneath the shift, the awareness, the sense that something had been set in motion and hadn't settled yet. By the time her shift ended, the sky had started to dim, the city easing into evening. Nina untied her apron, grabbed her bag, and stepped outside, the cool air hitting her face in a way that felt sharper than it had the night before. She started walking, not rushing, just moving in the direction of home. Her mind drifted despite her efforts to keep it quiet, circling back to the same question Roman had left behind, whether last night was a one-time decision or the start of something. She didn't like that it didn't feel like a simple answer. Her phone buzzed. Nina reached into her bag, already bracing herself. Derek, of course. She stared at the screen for a second before answering, not because she wanted to talk to him, but because ignoring him clearly wasn't going to make him disappear. What? She said, keeping her tone flat. There was a pause on the other end, like he hadn't expected her to pick up. So you do still answer your phone, Derek said, his voice quieter than before, but no less sharp. What do you want? We need to talk. No, we don't. Yes, we do, he replied. Because whatever that was last night, that wasn't you. Nina stopped walking for a second, then continued. You don't get to decide what is or isn't me anymore. You think I don't know you? Derek said. You don't just walk into a room and pull something like that unless you're trying to prove something. Maybe I was, she said. Maybe I'm done proving it to you. There was a brief silence, then a shift in his tone. Something tighter, more controlled. That guy. You have no idea who you're dealing with. Nina exhaled slowly. I know enough. No, you don't, Derek said. People like him don't do things for free. If he helped you, it's because he wants something. Not everything is a transaction, Derek. That's where you're wrong, he replied, especially with someone like him. Nina's grip on her phone tightened slightly. You're not concerned about me, she said. You're concerned about losing control. That's not what this is. It is, she said, and I'm not giving it back to you. Derek let out a sharp breath. You're making a mistake. Maybe, Nina said, but it's mine to make. She didn't wait for a response this time. She ended the call and slipped the phone back into her bag, her pulse steady but elevated, the conversation leaving a residue she couldn't shake completely. As she turned the corner onto her street, something made her slow down. It wasn't obvious, not at first, just a feeling, the kind that starts small, barely noticeable, then grows when you don't ignore it. Nina glanced over her shoulder. A man stood half a block back, leaning casually near a parked car. Dark jacket, hands in his pockets, posture relaxed, in a way that felt just a little too deliberate. When her eyes landed on him, he didn't look away immediately. That was enough. Nina turned forward again, her pace steady, not too fast, not too slow. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe she was reading too much into it after everything that had happened. Or maybe she wasn't. She kept walking, listening now, paying attention in a way she hadn't needed to before. The sound of footsteps behind her didn't match anyone else's. When she crossed the street, a few seconds later, so did he. Her pulse kicked slightly. She didn't panic. Not yet. Instead, she reached into her bag, pulling out her phone again, her fingers moving faster this time. One name came to mind without hesitation. She didn't question it. She just dialed. The line rang once, twice. Then, where are you? Roman's voice came through, immediate, alert in a way that told her he hadn't been surprised by the call. Nina let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. I think I'm being followed, she said, keeping her voice low, steady. There was no pause on his end this time. Don't turn around, he said, just keep walking. Tell me what you see. And just like that, without meaning to, Nina understood something she hadn't fully admitted to herself before. She hadn't called him because he was convenient. She had called him because she trusted him, and that realization was more dangerous than anything Derek had said. Describe him, Roman said, his voice low and controlled, the kind of calm that didn't try to comfort, just to stabilize. Nina kept walking, her pace steady even though her pulse had started to climb. Mid-30s, maybe, she said quietly. Dark jacket, hands in his pockets. He's trying to look casual, but he's not good at it. How far back? Half a block. He crossed when I crossed. There was a brief pause on the line, not hesitation, just calculation. Good, Roman said. That means he wants you to notice. Keep moving. Don't speed up. Stay where there are people. I am, Nina replied, glancing ahead. The street wasn't empty, but it wasn't crowded either. A couple walking a dog, someone unlocking a bike, a taxi idling at the curb. Normal, everyday movement. It should have felt safe. It didn't. Turn right at the next corner, Roman continued. There's a busier avenue. I'll meet you there. You're close? She asked. Close enough. Nina didn't question it. She reached the corner and turned, resisting the urge to look back again. The sound of footsteps followed a few seconds later. Not rushed, not hidden, just there. He's still behind me, she said. I know. You know? Nina repeated, her voice tightening slightly. I had someone keep an eye on the area after your call with Derek, Roman said. You weren't supposed to notice. Nina let out a breath, half frustration, half relief. You had someone watching me? Yes. That's not exactly reassuring. It's not supposed to be, he replied. It's supposed to keep you safe. She didn't have time to argue with that. Keep walking, Roman said. You're almost there. The avenue opened up ahead, brighter, louder, filled with more movement. Nina stepped into it. The shift immediate. The presence of more people giving her just enough space to breathe. Then she saw him. Roman moved toward her through the crowd, with the same controlled certainty she had seen the night before. No rush, no wasted motion, just direct intent. His eyes found her instantly, and in that moment, Everything else seemed to fall into place. "He's here," she said into the phone. "I see you," Roman replied, already lowering his own. Nina slowed just slightly as he reached her, her grip tightening on the phone before she slipped it back into her bag. For a second, neither of them spoke. Then Roman's attention shifted past her shoulder. "Don't turn," he said quietly. "I won't," she replied. Roman stepped closer, his presence enough to block the line between her and the man behind her. Nina felt it immediately, the shift in the air, the same controlled tension she had felt in the ballroom, but sharper now, more focused. "What are you going to do?" she asked under her breath. "Handle it," he said. Before she could respond, Roman moved past her. Nina didn't follow right away. She stood where she was, her body angled slightly toward the flow of people, trying to look like she wasn't waiting for something she couldn't see. A few seconds stretched longer than they should have. Then she heard it. Not loud, not enough to draw attention, but enough. A sharp voice, a low response, the sound of movement against brick. Nina turned despite herself. The alley wasn't far, just off to the side, partially hidden from the main street. Roman stood inside it, one hand gripping the man's jacket, holding him in place with an ease that made the imbalance obvious. The man who had been following her didn't look casual anymore. He looked cornered. Nina hesitated, then stepped closer, stopping just at the edge. "What are you doing?" the man snapped, trying to pull free. Roman didn't raise his voice. "You've been following her," he said. "That's not a coincidence." "I don't know what you're talking about," the man shot back, but the confidence wasn't there. Roman adjusted his grip slightly, not rough, just enough to remind him who was in control. "You can try that," he said. "Or you can save both of us time." The man's jaw tightened. "I was just walking." Roman tilted his head slightly. "You crossed when she crossed. You matched her pace. You stayed just far enough back to watch, without being obvious." He paused, then added, "That's not walking. That's a job." Silence stretched for a second. Then the man looked away first. "Who sent you?" Roman asked. The man hesitated, then muttered something under his breath. Roman's grip didn't change, but something in his expression did, just slightly. "Say it again." "Derek," the man said, louder this time. "All right?" He just wanted to know where she goes, who she talks to. That's it. Nina felt something cold settle in her chest. Roman didn't react immediately. He studied the man for a second longer, then released him with a small push that sent him stumbling back a step. "If I see you again," Roman said calmly. "We're not having this conversation twice." The man didn't argue. He straightened his jacket, gave Nina one last glance that held more frustration than threat, then turned and disappeared back onto the street. The alley went quiet. Nina stepped forward, her arms crossing instinctively as she looked at Roman. "You didn't have to do that," she said, though her voice lacked conviction. "Yes, I did," he replied. She shook her head slightly. "He said Derek sent him. I heard." "That means this isn't over," Nina said. Roman met her gaze. "No," he said. "It's not." For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Nina let out a slow breath. "I told him to leave me alone," she said. "I thought that would be enough." "It never is with people like that," Roman replied. Nina looked down briefly, then back up. "You were right." Roman didn't respond to that. He simply said, "You shouldn't walk alone tonight." "I've been walking alone my whole life," she said. "And now you're not," he replied. The certainty in his voice made her pause. "That's not how this works," Nina said. "It is now," Roman said. She studied him for a second, trying to find the line between concern and control, trying to decide which side he stood on. "You don't get to decide that for me," she said. "No," he agreed, "but I can make sure you get home safely." Nina hesitated. Part of her wanted to refuse, to prove that she could still handle this on her own, that she didn't need to rely on anyone, especially not him. But another part of her, the part that had felt the weight of being followed, the part that had called him without thinking, knew that the situation had already shifted. "Fine," she said finally, "just this once." Roman nodded once, like that was all he needed. They stepped back onto the main street together, the noise of the city closing in around them again. But it felt different now, more defined, more real. As they walked, Nina kept her gaze forward, her thoughts moving faster than she could organize them. Derek wasn't just angry. He was watching. He was acting. And whatever this had been before, Whatever space existed between her and Roman, it wasn't neutral anymore. It had turned into something else, something that neither of them could ignore. And for the first time since this started, Nina realized that walking away might not be an option anymore. The walk back to Nina's apartment was quieter than she expected, not because the city had slowed down, but because neither of them filled the space with unnecessary words. Roman walked half a step behind her at first, not crowding, not leading, just close enough to make it clear she wasn't alone anymore. Nina noticed it, the subtle positioning, the awareness in the way his attention moved between her and everything around them. It wasn't protective in the way she was used to. It was calculated, deliberate, like he had already mapped out every possible risk and decided which ones mattered. "You do that a lot?" she asked after a few blocks, breaking the silence without looking at him. "Do what?" Roman replied. "Step in like that. Handle things before they get worse." Roman didn't answer right away. "Only when they're already worse," he said eventually. Nina let out a quiet breath. That didn't look like already worse. That looked like routine. "It becomes routine if you don't deal with it early," he said. She glanced at him briefly, then forward again. "That's a very specific way of seeing the world." "It works." "For you," Nina said. Roman didn't argue with that. "Yes." They reached her building sooner than she expected, the familiar brick exterior and narrow entrance suddenly feeling different now that he was standing beside her. Nina stopped just outside, turning toward him, her hand resting lightly on the strap of her bag. "This is me," she said. Roman looked at the building, then back at her. "I'll wait until you're inside. You don't have to do that." "I know." Nina studied him for a second. "You're not going to leave unless I go in, are you?" "No." She exhaled, something close to a reluctant smile flickering across her face. "You're very persistent." "I'm very certain," he corrected. "That's not always a good thing. It depends on the situation." Nina held his gaze for a moment longer, then nodded. "All right, give me a minute." She turned and headed inside. The familiar creak of the door and the narrow stairwell greeting her like they always did. But this time, she felt it differently. She wasn't just stepping into her space, she was stepping away from him. Upstairs, she unlocked her door, stepped in, and closed it behind her. For a moment, she leaned against it, listening to the quiet settle around her. Everything was exactly where she left it. Nothing had changed, except it had. She moved to the window, glancing down at the street. Roman was still there, exactly where she had left him, hands in his coat pockets, looking up just slightly as if he already knew she'd be there. Nina hesitated, then tapped lightly on the glass. He saw her, and instead of leaving, he stayed. That was the moment something shifted again. She didn't overthink it this time. She grabbed her jacket, stepped back out, and headed downstairs. Roman hadn't moved far when she reached him. He looked at her, not surprised, just waiting. "You're still here," she said. "I said I would be." Nina nodded once. "I know." There was a brief pause, not uncomfortable, just unfinished. "You don't have to keep doing this," she said. "I'm inside. I'm fine." Roman studied her for a moment. "Are you?" Nina opened her mouth to answer, then stopped. The truth wasn't simple, and she wasn't in the mood to pretend it was. "I don't know yet," she admitted. That seemed to settle something in him. "Then I'll stay until you do," he said. Nina let out a quiet breath, somewhere between frustration and something softer. "You don't even know me." "I know enough," Roman replied. "That's what you said before," she said. "It's still not convincing." "It's not supposed to convince you," he said. "It's just the truth." She shook her head slightly, then leaned back against the side of the building, folding her arms loosely. "You realize this is exactly the kind of thing Derek used to do," she said. "Decide what I need before I say it." Roman's expression didn't change, but his tone shifted, just slightly. "I'm not deciding for you," he said. "I'm staying, because I chose to." "That's not very different." "It is," he replied. "You can tell me to leave." Nina met his eyes. "And you would?" "Yes." There was no hesitation in the answer. She believed him. That was the problem. Nina looked away first, her gaze drifting down the street where the city moved like it always did, indifferent to whatever was happening between two people standing just outside its rhythm. "I don't want you to leave," she said quietly. The words surprised her as much as they might have surprised anyone else. Roman didn't react immediately. He let the silence sit for a second, then said, "All right. No questions. No pressure. Just acceptance." Nina let out a slow breath, her shoulders relaxing slightly. "This is a bad idea," she added. "Probably," Roman agreed. "And you're still here?" "Yes." She glanced at him again, something almost like a smile pulling at the corner of her mouth. "You're very calm about all of this. I don't see a reason not to be." "I do," she said. "My ex is sending people after me. I'm standing outside my apartment with a man I barely know, who just handled that like it was nothing. That feels like a reason." Roman considered that. "Fair," he said. Nina huffed a small breath, shaking her head. "That's it? That's your response?" "It's accurate," he replied. For a moment, she just looked at him, then laughed quietly. The sound, unexpected but real. "You're impossible. I've been called worse." "I'm sure you have." The laughter faded, but the tension didn't return the way it had before. Something had shifted again, not entirely safe, not entirely clear, but steadier than it had been. Nina pushed off the wall, stepping a little closer. "What happens now?" she asked. Roman met her gaze. "Now we wait," he said. "For what?" "To see what he does next." Nina's jaw tightened slightly. "I don't like that answer. I didn't expect you to." She exhaled slowly. "I don't want to keep reacting to him. I don't want my life to turn into this." "It won't," Roman said. "You can't promise that." "No," he agreed. "But I can make sure he doesn't get to control how it ends." Nina held his gaze, searching for something: doubt, hesitation, anything that would make this feel less certain. She didn't find it. "That sounds a lot like control," she said. "It sounds like an outcome," he replied. There it was again. That way of speaking, like everything could be reduced to a decision and its consequences. Nina shook her head slightly. "You don't see things the way most people do you?" "No," Roman said. "I'm starting to notice." They stood there for a moment longer, the quiet stretching between them in a way that felt less empty now, more intentional. Then Nina said, "You can come upstairs." The words hung there, heavier than they should have been. Roman didn't move right away. "Are you sure?" he asked. Nina nodded once. "Yeah, I am." He studied her for a second, then gave a small nod. "All right." As they turned toward the building together, Nina felt it again, that shift, that awareness that something had crossed a line she couldn't redraw. This wasn't just about Derek anymore. This was about what came next, and whether she was ready for it or not, she had just chosen not to walk away. The apartment felt smaller with him inside, not because of the space itself, but because Roman didn't blend into anything. He didn't soften the edges of a room or adjust himself to fit it. He stood just inside the doorway for a second after Nina closed it, his gaze moving once, quietly taking in the layout, the narrow kitchen, the worn couch, the stack of books near the window. Nothing in his expression changed, but Nina felt the difference immediately, like her space had been measured and understood in a way no one else had ever bothered to do. "It's not much," she said, dropping her bag onto the counter, the words coming out more defensive than she intended. Roman shook his head slightly. "It's yours," he said. "That's enough." Nina glanced at him, then away, not sure why that landed the way it did. "Yeah," she murmured, moving toward the kitchen. "You want something? Water? Coffee?" "I don't have anything impressive." "Water's fine." She grabbed a glass, filled it, and handed it to him. Their fingers brushed briefly, and she noticed it, not because it meant anything, but because everything felt more noticeable with him around. Roman took the glass, nodding once, then leaned lightly against the counter like he had already decided where he would stand. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Nina crossed her arms loosely, glancing toward the window, then back at him. "This is weird," she said. "Yes. You don't even try to pretend it's not." "There's no point," Roman replied. She let out a small breath that almost turned into a laugh. "Right. Of course there isn't." Silence settled again, but it wasn't empty. It was filled with something unspoken, something that hadn't decided what it was yet. "You really had someone watching me?" she asked after a moment, her tone quieter now. Roman didn't hesitate. "Yes." Nina nodded slowly. "That's not normal." "No." "And you still did it?" "Yes." She studied him for a second, trying to find where that line was for him, where something became too much. "You don't ask permission for things like that." Do you? No, he said, because most of the time, people don't know they need it. That sounds a lot like control, Nina said. It sounds like prevention, he replied. She exhaled, rubbing her thumb lightly against her arm. You and Derek would get along in that department. Roman's expression didn't change, but his tone did, just slightly. No, he said. We wouldn't. The certainty in it made her pause. What's the difference? She asked. Roman looked at her for a moment before answering. He does it to keep you small, he said. I do it to make sure no one else can. The words settled heavier than she expected. Nina looked away first, her gaze drifting toward the window again. That doesn't feel as different as you think, she said. It is, Roman replied, because you can tell me to stop. And you would? Yes. There it was again. No hesitation, no conditions. Nina let out a slow breath. You make everything sound simple. It usually is. No, she said, shaking her head slightly. People just pretend it is. Roman didn't argue. He took a sip of water instead, letting the silence stretch for a second before speaking again. You called me, he said. Nina glanced back at him. I know. You didn't call the police. No. You didn't call a friend. She hesitated, then said, I did call someone. You called me, Roman repeated. There was no accusation in it. Just fact. Nina leaned back against the wall, folding her arms again. Yeah, she said quietly. I did. Why? The question wasn't sharp. It wasn't demanding. But it wasn't something she could brush off either. I don't know, she said at first, then stopped, realizing that wasn't entirely true. She exhaled slowly. Actually, I do know. Roman waited. Because I knew you'd pick up, she said, and I knew you'd handle it. That's not trust, he said. It's not? Nina asked. It's expectation, Roman replied. There's a difference. She considered that. Maybe, she said. But it felt like trust. Roman's gaze held hers for a second longer than necessary. That's more dangerous. Nina let out a quiet breath, something in her chest tightening and settling at the same time. Yeah, she said. I'm starting to figure that out. Another pause, softer this time. Are you scared? Roman asked. The question caught her off guard. Nina thought about it for a second, really thought about it, then shook her head. No, she said, not the way I was before. Before? Before, it was. Constant, she said, her voice steady but quieter now, like I had to think about everything I said, everything I did, because I didn't want to set him off. That kind of fear sticks. You don't even notice it after a while. Roman didn't interrupt. Nina looked down briefly, then back up. This is different, she continued. It's not about being scared of you. It's about, she hesitated, searching for the right word. Not knowing what this turns into. Roman nodded once. That's a better reason to be careful. Yeah, she said. It is. For a moment they just stood there, the quiet settling into something steadier. Then Nina pushed off the wall and walked toward the window, pulling the curtain back slightly to glance down at the street. You think he'll try something else tonight? She asked. Yes. She didn't react to the certainty this time. That's what I thought. Roman set the glass down on the counter. He won't come here, he said. You sound sure. I am. Nina glanced back at him. Because of you? Because of what he knows about me? Roman replied. That answer didn't comfort her as much as it should have. Right, she said softly. A few seconds passed before she let the curtain fall back into place. So what? You're just going to stay here all night? She asked. If that's what it takes. Nina turned fully toward him, studying him again. You really don't do halfway. Do you? No. That's exhausting. It's efficient. She smiled faintly at that, then shook her head. You're impossible. I've been told. Nina walked back toward the center of the room, stopping a few feet from him. You know this doesn't fix anything, right? She said. Derek's still out there. This whole situation, it's not going away just because you're standing here. I know, Roman said. So what's the plan? Roman met her gaze. We wait, he said, and when he makes his next move, we end it. Nina's expression tightened slightly. Ended how? Roman didn't answer right away. That was her answer. She exhaled slowly, running a hand through her hair. See, that's the part I don't like, she said. You say things like that like there's only one way it can go. There usually is, he replied. For you, Nina said. Not for me. Roman stepped a little closer. Not enough to crowd her, just enough to make sure she was looking at him when he spoke. Then we do it your way, he said. Nina blinked. Just like that? Yes. You don't even know what my way is. Then tell me, Roman said. The offer was simple, direct, real. Nina held his gaze, feeling the weight of it, the shift in control that didn't feel like control at all. I don't want him hurt, she said finally. I just want him out of my life. For good. Roman studied her for a second, then nodded once. All right. That's it? She asked. No argument? You're the one he's after, Roman said. You decide how it ends. Nina felt something ease in her chest, something she hadn't realized had been tight. Okay, she said quietly. Roman didn't move away, didn't push further. He just stood there, steady, present, like he had already committed to something he wasn't going to walk back from. And for the first time since this started, Nina didn't feel like she was reacting anymore. She felt like she was choosing. The night stretched longer than either of them expected, but it didn't feel heavy. It felt deliberate. Nina sat on the edge of her couch, one leg tucked under her, watching the city lights flicker through the window while Roman remained near the counter, still and composed, like time moved differently for him. At some point, the tension had stopped feeling sharp and started settling into something quieter, something that didn't demand constant attention but never fully disappeared either. You ever sleep? Nina asked after a while, her voice softer now, less guarded than it had been earlier. Roman glanced at her. When I need to. That sounds like a non-answer. It's accurate, he said. She huffed a small breath, not quite amused, not quite annoyed. You really don't do normal, do you? No, he replied. Nina nodded like she expected that. Yeah. I'm starting to see that. A few seconds passed, and she shifted slightly, leaning forward, resting her elbows on her knees. What happens if he shows up here? She asked. He won't, Roman said. You keep saying that, because it's true. And if it's not? Roman met her gaze, steady, unshaken. Then I handle it. Nina held his eyes for a moment, then looked away first. That's the part that worries me, she said quietly. Why? Because your version of handling things doesn't leave a lot of room for anything else, she replied. Roman didn't respond immediately. When he did, his tone was quieter, more measured. You said you don't want him hurt, he said. I heard you. I know you did, Nina said. I just don't know what that looks like in your world. Roman considered that. It looks like control, he said, not chaos. Nina let that sit for a second. Those two things aren't that far apart. They are if you know where the line is. And you do? Yes. She studied him again, searching for something that didn't quite show. That's a lot of confidence. It's experience. Nina leaned back slightly, exhaling through her nose. You ever get tired of being the one who decides where that line is? Roman didn't answer right away. No, he said eventually. Why not? Because if I don't, someone else will, he replied. That landed heavier than she expected. Nina didn't respond, her gaze drifting back toward the window. The city outside kept moving, unaware, unchanged. For a moment, she envied that. The simplicity of it. Her phone buzzed on the table. Both of them looked at it. Nina didn't reach for it right away. She already knew who it was. You should answer, Roman said. Why? She asked. Because he's not going to stop, Roman replied. And ignoring him won't make him disappear. Nina let out a slow breath, then picked up the phone. Derek. She stared at the name for a second, then answered. What? There was no hesitation on his end this time. We need to end this, Derek said. Nina frowned slightly. We already did. No, he said. Not like this. Like what? Like you're suddenly someone else, he snapped. Like you think standing next to that guy changes who you are. Nina's grip tightened slightly on the phone, but her voice stayed even. This has nothing to do with him. That's where you're wrong, Derek said. Everything about this has to do with him now. Roman didn't move, but Nina could feel his attention sharpen slightly. You're the one who sent someone after me, Nina said. You don't get to act like you're the one being wronged. I was making sure you were okay, Derek replied. That's not what that was, she said. That was control. It was concern. It was obsession. Nina corrected. There was a pause on the line. Then Derek's tone shifted, lower now, more dangerous in its calm. You really think he's better? He asked. You think a man like that doesn't control everything around him? Nina glanced at Roman for a second, then back down. At least he doesn't pretend it's something else. That landed. Silence stretched for a second too long. You're making a mistake, Derek said finally. Maybe, Nina replied, but it's not yours to fix. You don't get it, he said. You don't get how this ends. Then tell me, Nina said, because I'm done guessing. Another pause. Then, quieter, sharper, meet me, Derek said. Tomorrow. Somewhere public. We talk. We end this properly. Nina didn't answer right away. Roman's voice came low, steady. Where? Nina covered the phone slightly. He wants to meet. Public? Roman asked. Yes. Ask where? Nina nodded slightly, then spoke back into the phone. Where? Derek named a place. A cafe. Busy enough to feel safe, controlled enough to feel intentional. Nina closed her eyes for a brief second, then opened them again. Fine, she said. One conversation. That's it. That's all I'm asking for, Derek replied. The line went dead. Nina lowered the phone slowly, her thoughts already moving ahead of her. You're not going alone, Roman said. I wasn't planning to, she replied. That's not what I meant, he said. Nina looked at him. I know. A quiet moment passed between them. This is it, she said. Whatever he thinks this is, it ends tomorrow. Roman nodded once. Then we make sure it does. Nina stood, moving toward the window again, her reflection faint against the glass. For the first time since this started, the path forward felt clear. Not easy, not safe, but defined. She turned back to Roman. No violence, she said. I heard you, he replied. I'm serious. So am I, he said. She studied him for a second, then nodded slowly. Okay. The word felt like more than agreement. It felt like a line being drawn. Tomorrow wasn't just a conversation. It was the end of something that had held onto her for too long. And this time, she wasn't going to walk away from it. She was going to finish it. The story reminds us that courage is not always loud or dramatic. It often begins in quiet moments when someone decides they deserve better. Nina's journey shows that breaking free from control requires not only strength, but clarity, the ability to recognize manipulation, to reject fear, and to choose self-worth over comfort. At the same time, the story challenges the idea of protection, revealing that true safety is not about being controlled or saved, but about being respected and given the freedom to choose. In the end, justice is not always clean or perfect, but it begins the moment a person refuses to be powerless any longer. This video is a work of fiction created with the assistance of artificial intelligence. All characters, events, and situations are not real and do not represent any actual people or true stories. The content is intended for storytelling and emotional illustration only.